and a nation at war, the seeds of deception. The rain drummed against the blackout curtains of a modest London flat on a November evening in 1940. Inside, a Spanish businessman named Juan Pujol Garcia sat hunched over a typewriter, carefully crafting his latest intelligence report for his German handlers. His fingers moved deliberately across the keys as he described British troop movements, naval positions, and morale among the civilian population. Every detail was precise, every observation was compelling, and every single word was a lie. Garcia had never set foot in Britain. He was writing from Lisbon, armed with nothing more than a Baedeker guidebook, a map of the London Underground, and an imagination that would soon help change the course of the war. His fictional network of British sub-agents existed only in his mind, yet the Abwehr, German military intelligence, paid him handsomely for their reports. What the Germans didn't know was that Garcia despised fascism with every fibre of his being. He had created this elaborate deception entirely on his own initiative, hoping somehow to damage the Nazi war effort. This was the world of 1940, a world where truth and deception danced together in the shadows, where ordinary people made extraordinary choices, and where the fate of nations hung on the credibility of carefully constructed lies. To understand how we arrived at this moment of beautiful, dangerous duplicity, we must step back to September 1939, when Hitler's Wehrmacht crossed into Poland and set in motion the machinery of global war. Within days, Britain and France had declared war on Germany, but this was unlike any conflict the world had ever seen. Yes, there would be massive tank battles and aerial bombardments, but there would also be an invisible war fought with whispered conversations, forged documents, and the delicate art of turning enemy agents into unwitting allies. The British, despite their proud intelligence traditions, found themselves woefully unprepared for this shadow conflict. MI5, the Domestic Security Service, was a small, rather genteel organization better suited to monitoring Irish Republicans than countering the sophisticated espionage apparatus of Nazi Germany. When war broke out, the entire MI5 staff numbered fewer than 30 officers. They operated from a cramped building in South Kensington, filing their reports in cardboard boxes and relying on methods that hadn't changed substantially since the Victorian era. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the German Abwehr was already deploying agents throughout Europe. These weren't the bumbling caricatures that would later populate Hollywood films. Many were highly trained professionals, linguists who could pass for natives, wireless operators who could transmit from hidden locations, and recruiters who understood the subtle psychology of turning loyalty into betrayal. The Abwehr had spent years building networks, identifying potential assets, and preparing for the intelligence war that would complement their military campaigns. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. Because the Germans, despite their reputation for efficiency, had made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed that their enemies would play by the same rules they did. They expected to plant their agents, gather intelligence, and relay it back to Berlin in a straightforward exchange of information for money or ideology. What they couldn't anticipate was the peculiarly British genius for turning the entire system inside out. The first hints of what was possible came in the early months of the war, when MI5 began capturing German agents with surprising regularity. Some were caught through pure luck. A suspicious landlady here, an alert policeman there. Others fell victim to their own poor preparation. The Abwehr, it turned out, had some significant blind spots. They had trained their agents in German schools using German methods, but they hadn't fully grasped the subtleties of British life that would make their operatives blend in seamlessly. One agent was caught because he ordered a pint of beer at 10 in the morning. Perfectly normal in Germany, highly suspicious in wartime Britain. Another aroused suspicion by walking on the right side of the road. These might seem like trivial details, but in the world of espionage, trivial details can be the difference between success and a firing squad. As these captured agents accumulated in British custody, a small group of intelligence officers began to see an unprecedented opportunity. What if, instead of simply imprisoning or executing these spies, they could be persuaded to continue their work? But for Britain instead of Germany, what if the very network the Germans were building could be turned into an instrument of their own deception? The idea was audacious to the point of seeming impossible. It would require not just turning individual agents, but maintaining their cover stories, feeding them believable intelligence to pass along, and coordinating their activities so that their reports would reinforce each other rather than contradict. Most challenging of all, it would require understanding the German intelligence system well enough to give them exactly what they expected to hear, while gradually leading them toward precisely the wrong conclusions. The man who would eventually oversee this extraordinary operation was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Argyle Robertson, known to his colleagues as Tar. Robertson was a Scottish aristocrat who had served in the Seaforth Highlanders before joining MI5, but his military bearing concealed a mind that thought in layers of complexity and misdirection. He understood that the greatest deceptions are built not on obvious lies, but on carefully selected truths that lead the enemy to draw false conclusions. Robertson and his small team began developing what would become known as the double-cross system, though that name wouldn't emerge until later. In those early days, they were simply trying to solve an immediate problem: how to neutralize German intelligence operations in Britain while gathering information about German intentions and capabilities. The first breakthrough came with an agent codenamed Snow. Arthur Owens was a Welsh electrical engineer who had been recruited by the Germans before the war. When conflict erupted, he found himself in an impossible position: continue working for the Abwehr and face charges of treason, or cooperate with British intelligence and risk exposure as a double agent. Under Robertson's careful guidance, Owens chose cooperation. What made Snow valuable wasn't just his willingness to work for the British, but his established credibility with his German handlers. He had been reporting to them for months, building relationships and proving his reliability. Now, instead of cutting off this communication, Robertson's team could use it as a channel for controlled information. They could feed the Germans intelligence that was technically accurate but strategically misleading, reports that would satisfy German expectations while serving British interests. But managing a double agent proved to be extraordinarily complex work. Every message had to be crafted with multiple audiences in mind. It had to sound authentic to the Germans, serve British strategic objectives, and remain consistent with previous communications. The intelligence had to be valuable enough to maintain the agent's credibility, but not so valuable as to actually help the German war effort. And all of this had to be coordinated across multiple agents, each with their own cover stories and German handlers. As 1940 progressed and the Battle of Britain raged overhead, more German agents fell into British hands. Each capture presented the same choice: execution or recruitment. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Robertson and his team were assembling something unprecedented in the history of espionage: a comprehensive network of enemy agents working under British control. They had no way of knowing, in those early days, just how far this system would eventually reach. They couldn't foresee that their small operation would grow to encompass dozens of agents, that it would influence major strategic decisions, or that it would play a crucial role in the greatest deception operation of the war. They were simply intelligence officers trying to solve immediate problems with limited resources and unlimited imagination. But even then, as Juan Pujol Garcia sat in his Lisbon apartment creating fictional intelligence reports, the seeds of something extraordinary were being planted. The invisible war was beginning, and nothing would ever be quite what it seemed. The FECT Committee, birth of a system. The transformation from desperate improvisation to systematic deception required something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. A committee that would meet every Thursday morning to decide the fate of enemy agents and the flow of false intelligence across occupied Europe. Sir John Cecil Masterman emerged from the academic halls of Oxford to become the unlikely architect of this shadow war. A classical scholar turned intelligence officer, Masterman possessed the rare combination of intellectual rigor and moral flexibility that such work demanded. He understood that winning this particular battle would require not just courage, but a willingness to inhabit the grey spaces between truth and deception. The 20 Committee, named for the Roman numerals 30, a clever play on double cross, convened for the first time in January 1941. Picture the scene: a nondescript room in St. James's Street, where representatives from MI5, MI6, the War Office, and the Admiralty gathered around a mahogany table. Their mission was audacious in its scope: to control every single German agent operating on British soil. But first, they had to solve a fundamental problem. Traditional counterintelligence doctrine called for captured enemy spies to be executed or imprisoned. The 20 Committee proposed something far more dangerous and far more valuable. They would turn these agents, feeding them back to their German handlers as unwitting instruments of British deception. The risks were extraordinary. A single mistake, one moment of suspicious behavior, could expose not just an individual operation, but the entire network. Worse still, if the Germans suspected their agents had been compromised, they might feed false information back through the same channels, creating a deadly game of mirrors where no one could be certain what was real. Masterman and his colleagues understood they were walking into uncharted territory. There were no precedents for an operation of this scale, no textbooks on how to manage dozens of double agents simultaneously across multiple theaters of war. Every decision had to be made in real time, with incomplete information and the constant knowledge that lives hung in the balance. The ethical considerations alone were staggering. These captured agents, many of them barely trained civilians thrust into espionage by circumstance rather than ideology, faced a stark choice: cooperation or execution. The committee members told themselves they were offering these individuals a chance at survival, but they knew they were also exploiting human desperation for strategic advantage. Consider the case of Arthur Owens, codenamed Snow, the first agent to be successfully turned. A Welsh businessman with financial troubles, Owens had initially approached the Germans seeking payment for intelligence about British aircraft production. When MI5 arrested him in September 1939, he quickly agreed to work as a double agent rather than face the gallows. But managing Owens proved more complex than anyone anticipated. His motivations remained murky. Was he truly loyal to Britain or simply playing all sides for personal gain? The committee had to constantly evaluate his communications, ensuring that the information he passed to his German handlers was valuable enough to maintain their trust, but not so valuable as to genuinely aid the enemy war effort. This delicate balance became the central challenge of the double-cross system. Each piece of intelligence had to be carefully calibrated. True information, mixed with false, genuine secrets, sacrificed to establish credibility for larger deceptions. The committee members found themselves playing a chess game where every move rippled across multiple boards simultaneously. The psychological toll on the double agents themselves was immense. They lived in constant fear of discovery, knowing that a single misstep could mean death, either at the hands of their former German controllers or their current British ones. Many struggled with the moral ambiguity of their position, uncertain whether they were heroes, traitors, or simply prisoners with unusual accommodations. Masterman began keeping detailed records of every meeting, every decision, every success and failure. He understood that they were not just conducting intelligence operations, they were pioneering an entirely new form of warfare. Future conflicts would inevitably involve similar deception campaigns, and the lessons learned in those Thursday morning meetings would become the foundation for decades of covert operations. The committee's work extended far beyond individual agents. They had to coordinate with military planners, ensuring that false intelligence supported broader strategic objectives. They worked with the BBC and newspaper editors to plant stories that would reinforce their deceptions. They even collaborated with theatre set designers and makeup artists to create elaborate cover stories for their double agents. By mid-1941, the system was beginning to show results. German intelligence reports consistently overestimated British military strength and misidentified defensive positions. Enemy bombers, guided by false information, struck empty fields instead of aircraft factories. U-boats surfaced in waters where British destroyers waited in ambush. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement was simply that the system worked at all. In a coastal village somewhere along the English Channel, a German agent transmitted his evening report, never knowing that every word had been carefully crafted by the enemy he believed he was betraying. The invisible war had found its rhythm, and the dance of deception was just beginning. Teresa Teddy Miller, the handler. The quiet knock came at precisely 9 o'clock, as it always did. Teresa Miller set down her teacup and smoothed her wool skirt before opening the door to her modest Bloomsbury flat. The man standing in the hallway looked unremarkable, middle-aged, wearing a threadbare coat that had seen better days. To any observer, he might have been an insurance clerk or a shopkeeper calling on a neighbor. He was, in fact, a German spy. "Good evening, Hans," she said warmly, stepping aside to let him enter. "I've put the kettle on." Hans Kohler nodded gratefully, removing his hat with the careful politeness of a man who understood the delicate nature of his position. 6 months ago, he had parachuted into the English countryside with orders to report on British military preparations. Tonight, like every Tuesday evening for the past 4 months, he would sit in Theresa Miller's sitting room and craft radio messages that would deceive his handlers in Hamburg. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Theresa Miller, or Teddy as she was known to colleagues at MI5, possessed a rare combination of psychological insight and genuine empathy that made her invaluable to the double-cross system. Where interrogators might see an enemy to be broken, she saw a human being caught between impossible choices. Her approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. She treated her double agents not as prisoners, but as reluctant allies deserving of respect. "The weather's been dreadful," Hans remarked as he settled into the familiar armchair by the window. It was their ritual, these few minutes of ordinary conversation before the evening's work began. Theresa understood that maintaining some semblance of normal human interaction was crucial for agents operating under such extraordinary psychological pressure. "Indeed it has," she replied, pouring tea with practiced ease. "Though I suspect your friends across the channel are having it worse." Hans smiled ruefully. The gentle reminder of his situation, of whose side he was truly serving now, was delivered without malice. This was Theresa's gift, the ability to acknowledge difficult truths without making them feel like accusations. The path that had led Hans to this sitting room illustrated the complexity of the choices facing captured German agents. Execution was the traditional fate of enemy spies, but the double-cross system offered an alternative. Cooperation in exchange for life, reasonable treatment, and the possibility of surviving the war. For men like Hans, career intelligence officers, rather than fanatical ideologues, the choice was pragmatic rather than ideological. But cooperation was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in maintaining the delicate psychological balance necessary to function as a double agent. Theresa had studied Hans's file extensively before their first meeting. Born in Hamburg, educated at university, recruited by the Abwehr more for his language skills and methodical nature than for any particular devotion to Nazi ideology. He had a wife and daughter back in Germany, a fact that complicated his situation considerably. His cooperation protected his own life, but it also potentially endangered theirs. "I've been thinking about the report on shipping movements," Hans said, setting down his cup. The transition from pleasantries to business was always gradual, never abrupt. Theresa had learned that forcing the pace only increased anxiety. "What concerns you about it?" she asked, though she already knew. The previous week's transmission had included details about convoy movements that were entirely fictional, part of an elaborate deception designed to misdirect German U-boat deployments. Hans struggled with the magnitude of the lies he was telling his former colleagues. "If they act on this information," he began, then stopped. The implications hung in the air between them. German submarines would be hunting phantoms while real convoys slipped through undetected. Lives would be lost because of intelligence he had provided. Theresa leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Hans, we've discussed this before. Every choice in this war carries consequences. The question isn't whether people will die. They will, regardless of what we do. The question is whether your actions help end this conflict sooner." This was the psychological tightrope that Theresa walked with each of her agents. She couldn't pretend that their deceptions were harmless, nor could she allow them to be paralyzed by guilt. Instead, she helped them construct a moral framework that made their cooperation bearable, even justifiable. The evening's work proceeded methodically. Together, they crafted Hans's weekly report to Hamburg, a careful blend of accurate but harmless observations and strategic misinformation. Theresa's role was both editor and counselor, ensuring that the content served British interests while maintaining the authentic voice that would keep Hans credible to his handlers. "The RAF activity over Dover has increased significantly," she suggested, referring to notes prepared by the 20 committee. 3 squadrons of Spitfires observed conducting training exercises. Hans typed the message on his wireless set, each keystroke a small betrayal of his former allegiance. But Theresa had helped him understand that his true betrayal had occurred the moment he accepted his mission from the Abwehr, the betrayal of the ordinary people, German and British alike, who simply wanted the war to end. As the transmission concluded, Hans packed his equipment with practiced efficiency. The wireless set would be hidden until next week's report, its location known only to him and his Mi-5 handlers. "Same time next Tuesday?" Teresa asked, though she already knew the answer. "Of course," Hans replied, putting on his coat. At the door he paused. "Teddy, do you think they suspect anything? In Hamburg?" Teresa considered the question carefully. Intelligence suggested that the Abwehr remained confident in their British networks, unaware that virtually every agent had been turned. But overconfidence was dangerous in this business. "I think," she said finally, "that they believe what they want to believe, and we must ensure they continue to have good reasons for that belief." After Hans left, Teresa cleared the tea things and reviewed her notes from the evening. Tomorrow she would brief the 20 committee on the transmission, and they would analyze German responses for signs of suspicion or acceptance. But tonight, her work was done. In sitting rooms across London, similar scenes had played out. Mi-5 handlers working with their double agents to craft the elaborate fiction that was slowly reshaping German understanding of British capabilities and intentions. The enemy's view. While Teresa Miller and her colleagues worked through the London night, crafting their careful deceptions, hundreds of miles across the North Sea, their counterparts in the Abwehr faced challenges of their own. In the basement of a requisitioned hotel in Hamburg, Oberst Heinrich Müller bent over a map table, studying the scattered pins that marked his network of agents across Britain. Each pin represented months of training, careful insertion, and considerable expense. Yet the intelligence flowing back seemed inconsistent. The wireless sets crackled with reports from agents across England, production figures from aircraft factories, troop movements near Dover, morale assessments from bombed cities. On the surface, the information appeared valuable. But Müller had spent 15 years in intelligence work, and something felt wrong. "The timing is too convenient," he murmured to his aide, Hauptmann Weber. "Agent Ostro reports convoy movements just as we request shipping intelligence. Tate provides exactly the aircraft production data Berlin demands." He tapped the map with his pencil. "Real intelligence is messy, contradictory. This flows too smoothly." Weber shifted uncomfortably. Questioning agent reliability was dangerous territory. The Reich Security Main Office expected results, not doubts. "Perhaps our training has simply been effective, Herr Oberst." Müller said nothing. In the early days of the war, when agents crossed the channel by fishing boat or parachute, their reports had been erratic but authentic. Fragments of overheard conversations, rough estimates of military installations, the kind of imperfect intelligence that felt genuine. Now the reports arrived with mathematical precision, detailed order of battle assessments, precise factory output numbers, information so complete it seemed almost prepared. The irony was profound. The more successful the Abwehr appeared on paper, the more isolated they became from reality. Each carefully crafted transmission from a double agent like Hans Kohler pushed German intelligence further into a hall of mirrors, where truth and deception became indistinguishable. In his secure office, Müller reviewed the latest batch of agent reports. The pattern was there if you looked carefully: too much detail about secondary targets, too little about primary installations, reports that confirmed existing German assumptions rather than challenging them. But challenging the intelligence meant challenging the entire network. It meant admitting that months of planning, training, and operations had been compromised. It meant telling Berlin that their eyes and ears in Britain might be blind and deaf. The institutional pressure was enormous. Field commanders demanded intelligence for operational planning. The Reich Security Main Office required regular reports to justify budgets and personnel. The entire German war machine had developed an appetite for information that the Abwehr was expected to feed. So the reports continued flowing. Müller signed the assessments, forwarded the intelligence summaries, and maintained the fiction of an effective spy network. Because the alternative, acknowledging systematic failure, was professionally and personally catastrophic. In the North Atlantic, U-boat commanders relied on Abwehr intelligence about convoy routes and escort patterns. Luftwaffe planners used agent reports to select bombing targets. The entire German strategic picture of Britain was being shaped by information that flowed through channels the British controlled. Yet the machinery of intelligence continued its relentless operation. Wireless operators transmitted their scheduled reports. Analysts compiled their assessments. Commanders made their plans. The greatest deception operation in history succeeded not just through British cleverness, but through German institutional momentum that made questioning success almost impossible. Armour, turning the tide, Garbo and Tricycle. Among the shadows of wartime England, two men walked paths that would reshape the very nature of deception. Neither began as a spy, neither sought the role that history would thrust upon them. Yet Juan Pujol Garcia and Dusko Popov would become the architects of illusion, the masters of a craft that turned lies into weapons more powerful than artillery. Garcia had arrived in Britain through a journey that defied all logic. A Spanish businessman with no intelligence training, no military background, no apparent qualifications for espionage, he had simply decided that Hitler must be stopped. The audacity was breathtaking. In 1941, he had walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered his services as a spy. The British had turned him away. Undeterred, Garcia had approached the Germans instead. He convinced the Abwehr that he was a fanatical Nazi sympathizer, desperate to serve the Reich. They accepted him eagerly and assigned him to spy on Britain. The irony was exquisite. Garcia would become a German agent specifically to betray Germany. From Lisbon, he began sending reports to his German handlers about British military installations, detailed observations, troop movements, naval activities. The Germans were delighted with their new recruit, never suspecting that Garcia had never set foot in Britain. He crafted his intelligence reports from guidebooks, newspapers, and his own fertile imagination. When he finally made contact with British intelligence again, they realized they had encountered something unprecedented. Here was a man who had single-handedly created his own double-agent operation and made the Germans pay for it. MI5 brought Garcia to England and gave him the codename Garbo. Under their guidance, his fictional network began to flourish with mathematical precision. He invented sub-agents across Britain, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow, a Welsh nationalist in Swansea, an American sergeant willing to sell secrets for money. Each character had a complete backstory, distinct personality, believable motivations. The Germans never questioned why they were suddenly receiving reports from 27 different sources, all coordinated by their star agent in London. Meanwhile, in a very different corner of the intelligence war, Dusko Popov moved through the elegant drawing rooms of wartime society with the confidence of a man born to deception. Where Garcia was driven by ideology, Popov seemed motivated by the sheer intellectual challenge of the game. A Yugoslav lawyer from a wealthy family, Popov had been recruited by the Abwehr while studying in Germany. But his loyalties lay elsewhere, with the British intelligence officers who had approached him first. When he arrived in London in 1940, he carried German questionnaires seeking information about British defences. He handed them directly to his MI5 controllers. They gave him the codename Tricycle, a reference to his apparent fondness for managing relationships with multiple romantic partners simultaneously. Even in wartime, the British maintained their talent for understatement. Popov's value lay not just in his access to German intelligence priorities, but in his ability to move freely between occupied Europe and Britain. He became a courier of deception, carrying carefully crafted intelligence back to his German handlers. Each trip was a masterpiece of calculated risk. In Belgrade, he would meet with Abwehr officers and deliver reports that seemed to reveal British weaknesses. Airfield locations that were actually decoys. Industrial capacity figures that understated British production. Morale assessments that suggested a population on the verge of collapse. The Germans filed his reports with satisfaction, never realizing they were being systematically misdirected. Both men understood that credibility required sacrifice. Garbo's fictional network occasionally had to provide genuine intelligence to maintain German trust. Minor details, outdated information, facts that British intelligence could afford to lose. The art lay in calibrating the mixture, enough truth to sustain belief, enough deception to serve British purposes. Popov faced even more delicate calculations. During his travels, he encountered real German intelligence operations. Sometimes he had to allow minor British assets to be compromised to protect his own position. The moral weight of these decisions pressed against him, but the strategic value of his continued access justified almost any cost. As 1943 progressed into 1944, both agents began receiving German questionnaires with a new urgency. Questions about southeastern England, Dover area defences, port facilities in Kent. The pattern was unmistakable. German intelligence was focusing on the most obvious invasion route. This was the moment the double-cross system had been designed to create. The opportunity to shape German perceptions at the crucial moment when deception could determine the fate of nations. Garbo's network began reporting massive military buildups in southeastern England, American divisions arriving daily, tank formations massing in Kent, fuel depots expanding around Dover. His sub-agents provided corroborating details from multiple perspectives, creating an intelligence picture of overwhelming consistency. Popov carried similar reports during his travels to Lisbon and Belgrade. He spoke of British preparations that seemed to confirm German expectations. The invasion would come at Calais, exactly where German intuition suggested it must come. Neither man knew the true target of the Allied invasion. That information was compartmentalized far above their clearance level. They were told only what they needed to know to make their deceptions convincing. In some ways, this ignorance was their greatest strength. They could not accidentally betray what they did not know. The psychological pressure was immense. Garcia worked 18-hour days maintaining his fictional network, crafting reports that balanced revelation with concealment. Popov traveled constantly, each border crossing a potential death sentence if his true loyalties were discovered. Yet both men understood they were participating in something larger than individual survival. They were reshaping the information environment that would determine how German commanders deployed their forces, where they expected the blow to fall, how they prepared their defenses. In the quiet hours before dawn, as Garcia typed another report from his imaginary agent in Dover, or as Popov reviewed his notes before another meeting with German intelligence, they were writing the invisible chapters of a story that would determine whether democracy survived in Europe. The greatest deceptions require the most dedicated deceivers. And in Garbo and Tricycle, the double-cross system had found artisans of illusion whose commitment to their craft would help turn the tide of war. The art of deception, spreading misinformation. The art of deception begins with the smallest details: the texture of paper, the particular blue of German ink, the precise way a wireless operator taps out Morse code. In the secret bunkers beneath London, where concrete walls muffled the sounds of the Blitz above, British intelligence officers worked with their double agents to perfect these minutiae of betrayal. Each transmission to Germany was a masterpiece of calculated lies wrapped in just enough truth to maintain credibility. Garbo's fictional network had grown so elaborate that his German handlers now believed they were receiving intelligence from 27 different sub-agents scattered across Britain. In reality, every single report originated from Pujol's imagination, filtered through the careful analysis of his MI5 case officer, Thomas Harris. The process was methodical, almost scientific. Harris would arrive each morning at the nondescript building in Jermyn Street, carrying newspapers, weather reports, and carefully selected genuine intelligence that had been deemed safe to share. Together, he and Pujol would craft the day's deceptions, mixing real observations with strategic falsehoods in proportions as precise as a pharmacist's formula. Agent 3 reports increased rail traffic through Dover. Pujol might transmit in his distinctive Morse rhythm. This was true. Dover did see increased rail traffic. What the message failed to mention was that most of those trains carried empty freight cars, part of an elaborate theatrical production designed to suggest preparations for a Calais invasion. The Germans, receiving accurate information about rail schedules, naturally assumed the cargo was genuine. Tricycle's deceptions required different artistry. Where Garbo painted with broad strokes of imagination, Popov worked in the subtle shades of social intelligence. His cover as a wealthy Yugoslav playboy granted him access to diplomatic circles, military clubs, and society gatherings where loose tongues might reveal Allied secrets. or so his German handlers believed. In reality, every conversation Popov reported had been carefully orchestrated. MI5 would arrange for him to overhear specific discussions, conversations between actors playing the roles of concerned officers, worried about fictitious troop movements and non-existent supply shortages. These manufactured indiscretions would find their way into Popov's reports to Berlin, each one reinforcing the grand deception that the Allies planned to strike at the Pas de Calais. The wireless transmissions themselves presented constant technical challenges. German radio direction-finding equipment could pinpoint transmission locations with increasing accuracy. To counter this, the double agents moved frequently, broadcasting from different safe houses across London, each equipped with carefully tuned radio sets and emergency escape routes. More dangerous still was the risk of transmission analysis. German cryptographers studied not just the content of messages, but their rhythm, their timing, their characteristic patterns. Each wireless operator developed a unique fist, a personal signature in the way they tapped out Morse code. If that signature changed too dramatically, or if the timing patterns shifted, German intelligence might suspect their agent had been captured and replaced. Theresa Miller understood these dangers intimately. Her agent, Hans Kohler, transmitted twice weekly to Hamburg, always at precisely the same times, always with the same nervous hesitation before sending coordinates. She had spent months studying the recordings of his original transmissions from before his capture, learning to recognize the subtle rhythms that marked his authentic style. But maintaining that authenticity while crafting strategic deceptions created constant tension. Kohler's German handlers expected him to take risks, to probe for sensitive information, to demonstrate the aggressive initiative of a committed Nazi agent. Yet every risk he appeared to take had to be carefully calculated by MI5, dangerous enough to seem genuine, safe enough to avoid compromising actual operations. The psychological pressure on the double agents themselves was immense. They lived in a state of permanent performance, never able to fully relax, always conscious that a single mistake might expose not just themselves, but the entire network of deception that had taken years to construct. Garbo, despite his natural theatrical gifts, sometimes showed signs of strain. Harris would find him pacing his small flat in Hendon, muttering in Spanish as he rehearsed the latest fiction about his imaginary sub-agent in Scotland. The weight of maintaining 27 fictional identities, each with their own personality and perspective, sometimes seemed to blur the boundaries of Pujol's own sense of self. Tricycle managed the pressure differently, channeling his nervous energy into the very lifestyle that provided his cover. His reputation for expensive tastes and romantic adventures was not entirely fabricated. The gambling, the parties, the affairs, all served to maintain his persona while providing outlets for the stress of his double life. The German responses to these deceptions revealed the growing success of the operation. Intelligence intercepts showed that Berlin was repositioning troops based on the false information, moving divisions away from Normandy toward the Pas de Calais, exactly as Allied planners hoped. But success brought its own dangers. The more valuable the Germans considered their British spy network, the more resources they devoted to protecting and verifying it. Counterintelligence operations increased. New handlers were assigned to cross-check reports. Technical specialists analyzed transmission patterns with growing sophistication. Each month brought fresh challenges to the delicate balance of the deception. A casual question from Hamburg about local weather patterns that didn't match official reports. A request for photographs of installations that didn't exist. Instructions to make contact with other German agents who had long since been captured or turned. The double-cross team developed increasingly elaborate responses to these challenges. They created fake weather reports that matched the fictional locations of imaginary sub-agents. They commissioned professional photographers to create convincing images of decoy installations. They orchestrated careful meetings between different double agents, allowing them to corroborate each other's stories while maintaining their separate fictional networks. In the bunkers beneath London, the walls were covered with maps, charts, and photographs, a visual representation of the parallel universe they had created for German consumption. Red pins marked the locations of fictional agents. Blue lines traced imaginary supply routes. Yellow markers indicated decoy installations that existed only in carefully crafted reports. This was more than intelligence work. It was the creation of an alternate reality, as detailed and convincing as any work of fiction, yet designed not to entertain, but to deceive. Every element had to be perfect, every detail cross-referenced and verified within its own internal logic. The stakes could not have been higher. Each transmission carried the potential to save thousands of Allied lives, or to expose the entire deception and doom the invasion before it began. Operation Fortitude, the ultimate test. By the winter of 1943, the elaborate web of deception had grown into something far more ambitious. Operation Fortitude. This was the code name for what would become the most successful military deception in human history. The goal was breathtakingly audacious: convince the entire German military apparatus that the Allied invasion of Europe would strike at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. The strategic logic was elegant in its simplicity. Calais represented the shortest crossing of the English Channel, a mere 21 miles of water separating the Allied forces from Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Any reasonable military planner would choose this route. The Germans knew this. The Allies knew the Germans knew this, and therein lay the perfect foundation for deception. General George S. Patton found himself cast in the starring role of this elaborate theater. The Germans considered him America's finest field commander, the one man they feared most. Intelligence reports had convinced them that wherever Patton went, the main Allied assault would surely follow. So British intelligence gave them exactly what they expected to see. The 1st United States Army Group materialized in southeastern England. On paper, in radio transmissions, and in carefully orchestrated glimpses designed for German reconnaissance flights. FUSAG, as it became known, existed primarily in the imagination of its creators. Yet every detail had to be perfect. Radio operators transmitted authentic-sounding military chatter. Engineers constructed plywood tanks and inflatable landing craft. Actors in American uniforms moved through English villages, spending money and creating the impression of a massive military buildup. Juan Pujol Garcia, our master fabricator Garbo, became the primary conduit for this strategic fiction. His network of imaginary sub-agents reported troop movements, equipment concentrations, and logistics preparations. Each report painted a picture of Allied forces massing for an assault on Calais. The beauty lay in mixing truth with fiction. Real units were reported in false locations. Genuine preparations were attributed to fictitious operations. The psychological pressure on the double agents during this period was immense. Garbo understood that millions of lives hung in the balance of his performance. One inconsistency, one detail that failed to align with German expectations, could unravel the entire deception. His handlers watched him carefully for signs of stress. The weight of carrying such secrets had broken lesser men. Meanwhile, in Berlin, German intelligence officers pored over every transmission. The Abwehr had grown increasingly dependent on their British-based spy network. Reports from Garbo and his fellow double agents formed the backbone of German understanding of Allied intentions. The irony was profound. The more successful the German intelligence apparatus appeared, the more completely they were being deceived. Colonel Alexis von Roen, head of Foreign Armies West, found himself in an impossible position. His job was to assess Allied capabilities and intentions. The intelligence flowing from Britain painted a clear picture: massive forces preparing for assault on Calais. Yet something felt wrong. The reports were almost too perfect, too consistent. But questioning the intelligence meant questioning the competence of the entire German spy network. Institutional pressures demanded optimistic assessments. Hitler wanted to hear that his Atlantic Wall was impregnable. Field commanders wanted confirmation that they were defending the right sectors. The intelligence that supported these preconceptions was welcomed. Reports that challenged them were scrutinized harshly. As spring turned towards summer in 1944, the deception entered its most critical phase. Real Allied preparations for D-Day could not be completely hidden. German reconnaissance flights photographed genuine invasion preparations in southern England, but the fictional build-up in southeastern England appeared even larger, even more threatening. The double agents worked around the clock, transmitting a steady stream of carefully crafted misinformation. Garbo reported that his sub-agent in Dover had observed massive concentrations of landing craft. Another fictional source described new airfields being constructed in Kent. Each piece of intelligence reinforced the central deception. The main Allied assault would target Calais. The technical challenges of maintaining this deception were staggering. British intelligence had to create an entire parallel reality, complete with fictional military units, imaginary supply chains, and fabricated personnel records. If German intelligence attempted to verify any detail, they had to find supporting evidence. Radio intercepts had to match reported unit locations. Aerial reconnaissance had to reveal appropriate military installations. The 20 Committee met weekly to coordinate these efforts. Every transmission was carefully planned. Every piece of intelligence cross-referenced against the larger narrative. They were writing history in real time, creating a fictional version of Allied preparations that would determine the fate of the actual invasion. Theresa Miller found herself managing multiple agents simultaneously. The stress was overwhelming. Each day brought new demands for intelligence, new opportunities to reinforce the deception or accidentally expose it. She watched her agents carefully for signs of psychological strain. The burden of maintaining fictional identities while serving as conduits for strategic deception tested the limits of human endurance. German field commanders in France received these intelligence assessments with growing concern. The 15th Army, positioned to defend Calais, appeared to face the primary Allied threat. Additional reinforcements flowed toward the Pas-de-Calais region. The 7th Army, defending Normandy, received lower priority for men and equipment. The deception had achieved its primary objective. German forces were positioned to repel an invasion that would never come. But the operation had to continue even after D-Day. If the Germans realized immediately that Normandy was the main assault, they could rapidly redeploy their reserves. The double agents would need to convince German intelligence that Normandy was merely a feint, that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. As June approached, the weight of responsibility pressed down on everyone involved in Operation Fortitude. They had created the most elaborate deception in military history. They had manipulated enemy intelligence services with unprecedented success. But the ultimate test was still to come. The fictional army group continued its preparations for an invasion that existed only in German minds. Radio operators transmitted final coordination messages. The double agents reported last-minute intelligence about assault preparations. Every detail had to maintain the illusion, even as the real invasion fleet prepared to sail toward an entirely different destination. The success of D-Day would depend not just on Allied courage and planning, but on whether a handful of turned German spies could continue convincing their handlers that the main blow would fall elsewhere. The fate of Operation Overlord rested in the hands of men and women who had mastered the art of strategic deception. History held its breath. Living a lie, the psychological toll. The weight of deception pressed down on them like the London fog that rolled through the city's narrow streets each morning. Juan Pujol Garcia would wake in his modest flat, run his fingers through his hair, and prepare to become someone else entirely. For these men and women living at the heart of the double-cross system, each day began with the same fundamental question. Which version of themselves would they inhabit today? The loyal German agent reporting to Hamburg, the British asset crafting careful lies, or somewhere in between, a person caught in the liminal space between truth and fiction, loyalty and betrayal. Garcia had become a master of compartmentalization. His wife, Araceli, knew nothing of his work beyond vague references to government service. She saw him hunched over his wireless set in the evenings, heard the steady tap-tap-tap of Morse code, but the elaborate network of fictional sub-agents he managed remained invisible to her. 27 imaginary spies scattered across Britain, each with their own personality, their own motivations, their own carefully constructed backstories. The psychological toll was immense. Garcia found himself remembering conversations that had never happened, worrying about the welfare of people who existed only in his reports to German intelligence. Agent 7-4, the fictional guard at an RAF base, had Garcia given him a convincing reason for his recent silence. Agent 3-3, the supposed Venezuelan student in Glasgow, was his personality consistent with his earlier reports. Dusko Popov faced different demons. His role required him to maintain his playboy facade while carrying secrets that could alter the course of the war. At London's exclusive clubs, he would laugh at the right jokes, flirt with the appropriate women, all while calculating which details of his evening might serve the deception. A casual mention of troop movements overheard at dinner, a complaint about increased security at Dover. Each social interaction became a performance within a performance. The strain showed in subtle ways. Popov's legendary charm began to feel mechanical, even to himself. He would catch his reflection in restaurant windows and wonder which man was looking back, the carefree Yugoslav socialite or the British double agent. The boundaries had blurred beyond recognition. Teresa Miller watched her charges with growing concern. In her weekly reports to the XX committee, she noted the signs of psychological fatigue. Garcia had developed a nervous habit of checking and rechecking his transmissions. Popov's famous wit had acquired a brittle edge. These were not ordinary intelligence officers trained for the mental rigors of espionage. They were civilians thrust into an impossible situation, asked to maintain elaborate fictions while the fate of nations hung in the balance. The moral weight proved equally crushing. Garcia genuinely believed in the Allied cause, yet he spent his days crafting reports that would lead young German soldiers to their deaths. Every fictional observation about Allied strength at Dover, every fabricated detail about invasion preparations would eventually translate into Wehrmacht units positioned in the wrong place at the wrong time. Real men would die because of his lies. The irony was not lost on him. He had begun this journey as a private citizen, trying to fight fascism in his own small way. Now he found himself responsible for strategic deceptions that would reshape the war's outcome. The magnitude of his responsibility kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his London flat while his wife slept peacefully beside him. Popov's moral landscape was even more complex. His German handlers trusted him completely. Some had become something approaching friends during his years of service. When he transmitted false intelligence about Allied capabilities, he was betraying not just an enemy intelligence service, but individual human beings who had placed their faith in him. The personal cost extended beyond guilt and psychological strain. Normal relationships became impossible when your entire existence was built on deception. Garcia's marriage suffered as the distance between his public and private selves widened. How could he share the burden of his work when sharing meant death? Not just for himself, but for the entire double-cross operation. Popov found intimacy equally elusive. Every relationship was tainted by the fundamental dishonesty of his position. Women were attracted to the glamorous Yugoslav businessman, but that man was largely fictional. The real Popov was buried beneath layers of carefully constructed identity, accessible to no one. The supporting cast of the double-cross system faced their own psychological challenges. Radio operators who transmitted the false intelligence, case officers who managed the intricate deceptions, administrative staff who maintained the elaborate fictional networks. Each person carried a piece of the lie, and the weight was distributed but never diminished. Some found solace in the righteousness of their cause. They were fighting Hitler, protecting democracy, saving lives through strategic deception, but others struggled with the fundamental dishonesty of their work. Intelligence officers, trained to seek truth, found themselves professional manufacturers of falsehood. The city around them remained largely oblivious to their burden. London's streets bustled with ordinary wartime activity. Queues for rationed goods, blackout preparations, the constant awareness of air raid sirens. But for the double-cross operatives, every public space became a stage for their performance. Garcia would walk through Hyde Park, mentally rehearsing his next transmission to Hamburg. Which fictional agent would report next? What plausible intelligence could he provide to maintain credibility while supporting the fortitude deception? The park's peaceful atmosphere offered no respite from the constant mental calculations. Popov's evenings at the Savoy Hotel were exercises in controlled schizophrenia. He would charm dinner companions while simultaneously evaluating them as potential sources of misinformation for his German handlers. Every conversation served multiple purposes. Every casual remark was analyzed for its deception potential. The approaching D-Day invasion intensified these psychological pressures exponentially. The double agents knew that their greatest test lay ahead. Soon, their years of careful deception would face ultimate validation. If the Germans discovered the truth, if the double-cross system was exposed, the invasion itself might fail. This knowledge transformed their daily burden into something approaching existential crisis. Garcia found himself unable to read newspapers without calculating how each piece of war news might affect his fictional network. Popov's social calendar became a careful balance between maintaining his cover and gathering intelligence that could support the final deception. The psychological toll of living multiple lives simultaneously had pushed these individuals to the breaking point of human endurance. Yet they persevered, driven by duty, patriotism, and the terrible knowledge that failure meant not just personal destruction, but potential catastrophe for the Allied cause. In the quiet moments between transmissions, in the brief spaces between one performance and the next, they confronted the fundamental question that haunted every double agent. When the war ended, who would they be? The elaborate fictional selves they had constructed felt increasingly real, while their original identities faded like photographs left too long in sunlight. The human cost of strategic deception was measured not just in stress and moral ambiguity, but in the gradual erosion of authentic selfhood. These men and women were winning the war, but losing themselves in the process. Neutral territory. Nowhere was this strange twilight existence more visible than in the cafes of Lisbon, where the war's shadow games played out in plain sight. Portugal's capital had become Europe's last neutral crossroads, a city where German officers might share the same restaurant with British intelligence operatives, where Spanish diplomats conducted business at tables adjacent to American OSS agents, where the elaborate theater of wartime espionage unfolded beneath a veneer of civilized normalcy. The Café Central on Rossio Square epitomized this surreal atmosphere. Its marble tables hosted a daily parade of spies, double agents, and intelligence officers from every nation, all maintaining the polite fiction that they were merely businessmen, journalists, or cultural attachés. The Portuguese authorities understood the game perfectly, turning a blind eye to activities that kept their country profitable and nominally peaceful. Teresa Miller found herself in Lisbon that autumn, ostensibly accompanying a trade delegation, actually managing a crucial handoff with one of Garcia's sub-agents. She sat at a corner table, watching the intricate dance of deception unfold around her. 2 tables away, a man she recognized as Oberst Friedrich Kessler from German military intelligence reviewed documents with theatrical casualness. He was hunting for signs of the very deception network she helped orchestrate. Yet here they sat, separated by mere yards and an ocean of secrets. The irony was almost overwhelming. Kessler had likely read Garcia's latest reports, perhaps even praised their accuracy to his superiors in Berlin. He had no idea that the woman sipping coffee 20 feet away helped craft every carefully calculated lie, every strategic misdirection that shaped his understanding of Allied capabilities. At the bar, a Portuguese businessman conducted animated negotiations with what appeared to be a Swedish timber merchant. Miller recognized the subtle signs, the way conversations paused when strangers approached, the careful positioning that allowed clear sightlines to exits, the documents that never quite left their owner's immediate reach. Everyone was performing, everyone was watching, everyone understood that beneath Lisbon's cosmopolitan charm lay a web of competing intelligence operations that could shift the war's trajectory. The city's neutrality created a peculiar intimacy among adversaries. These were professionals who respected each other's craft, even as they worked to destroy each other's nations. They shared the same hotels, frequented the same restaurants, sometimes even exchanged polite nods of recognition. Miller observed a fascinating ritual at the hotel bars each evening, where German, British, American, and Spanish intelligence officers gathered in an unspoken truce. Conversations remained carefully superficial, touching on weather, local customs, the quality of Portuguese wine, while each participant mentally catalogued details about their opponent's behavior, contacts, and possible operations. This civilized veneer masked constant calculation. Every gesture was analyzed, every casual remark dissected for hidden meaning, every new face memorized and investigated. The city hummed with a tension that never quite erupted into open confrontation, held in check by Portugal's determined neutrality and everyone's recognition that Lisbon served their purposes better as neutral ground than as a battlefield. As Miller prepared to leave, having successfully completed her mission, she caught Kessler's eye across the cafe. For a moment, their gazes held. Perhaps he sensed something. Perhaps it was merely coincidence. He raised his coffee cup in a slight salute, a gesture she returned with careful neutrality. Neither acknowledged what they both understood, that they were adversaries in a war fought with information rather than bullets, where victory meant convincing your enemy to believe your carefully constructed lies. And planning the invasion. Back in London, the intelligence gathered from such encounters flowed into rooms where the true architects of deception worked with maps and mathematics, calculating the precise choreography of strategic misdirection. The combined operations planning room occupied the basement levels beneath Whitehall, its walls lined with detailed maps of the French coastline. Here, in fluorescent-lit chambers that never saw daylight, staff officers moved colored pins across acetate overlays, each representing thousands of men who would soon cross the Channel. Colonel David Strangeways stood before the largest map, studying the coastline between Le Havre and Cherbourg. As Chief of Tactical Deception for 21st Army Group, he understood that every piece of misinformation fed through the double-agent network had to support this single geographical reality. The Normandy beaches, with their complex tidal patterns and defensive positions, represented not just a military objective, but the culmination of 3 years of carefully orchestrated lies. The beauty of Fortitude South, he explained to his assembled staff, lies not in its complexity, but in its fundamental simplicity. We convinced the Germans that Calais remains our primary target, while every genuine preparation points toward Normandy. The maps told the story in precise detail. Calais offered the shortest channel crossing, the most logical choice for any invasion force. Its proximity to German industrial centers made it strategically obvious, which was exactly why the deception worked so effectively. German defensive doctrine assumed Allied commanders would choose the most direct route, an assumption that Strangeways and his colleagues exploited ruthlessly. On the adjacent wall, intelligence summaries tracked German troop movements responding to their fictional army groups. The 15th Army remained concentrated around Calais, exactly where Allied deception wanted them. Meanwhile, Rommel's Atlantic Wall fortifications in Normandy, while formidable, received fewer reinforcements than they might have otherwise. Lieutenant Colonel Roger Hesketh, responsible for coordinating intelligence from the double agents, pointed to intercept summaries spread across the central table. Garcia's network continues to report fictional preparations around Dover, he noted, while Popov confirms our Phantom Army Group movements through southeastern England. The room hummed with quiet efficiency, officers correlating weather reports, tide tables, and German defensive intelligence into a comprehensive operational picture. Each element had to align perfectly, because the margin for error in amphibious assault was measured in thousands of lives. Strangeways traced the Normandy coastline with his finger, following the beaches code-named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The preliminary bombardment begins at 0300, he said quietly, followed by airborne drops at 0130. First wave hits the beaches at 0630, assuming weather conditions permit. The weight of decision rested ultimately with Eisenhower, but the foundation for that decision had been built through months of strategic deception. Every false report, every carefully crafted lie transmitted through the double-agent network had created the conditions that made Normandy possible. In these underground rooms, surrounded by maps and classified documents, the abstract concept of deception became concrete military reality. The psychological manipulation conducted by agents like Garcia and Popov, the careful intelligence fed through channels monitored by German handlers, all of it converged on this moment of tactical planning. The invasion would succeed or fail based on whether the Germans believed the lies they had been told, and whether Allied forces could exploit the strategic confusion that deception had created. D-Day and its aftermath. The morning of June 6, 1944, brought with it the sound of aircraft engines, thousands of them, stretching across the English Channel like a mechanical storm. As Allied paratroopers descended into the Norman countryside and landing craft approached the beaches, the greatest test of wartime deception was about to reveal itself. In the German command bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, confusion reigned. Reports filtered in of landings at Normandy, but German intelligence still insisted the main assault would come at Calais. The fictional 1st United States Army Group, Garcia's imaginary network of divisions, Popov's carefully crafted reports. All of it had taken root so deeply in German strategic thinking that even as real Allied soldiers stormed real beaches, Wehrmacht commanders hesitated. Field Marshal Rommel was away from his headquarters, attending his wife's birthday celebration. The German High Command, convinced by months of deception that Normandy was merely a feint, held back their panzer reserves. They waited for the real invasion that would never come. By afternoon, as Allied forces established their foothold on French soil, the magnitude of German miscalculation became clear. The double agents had succeeded beyond their handlers' most optimistic projections. Theresa Miller, monitoring reports from her London office, felt the weight of months of tension finally beginning to lift, though she knew the war was far from over. In those crucial first hours, as German reinforcements remained positioned to defend against phantom armies, as real Allied divisions pushed inland from Omaha and Gold and Juno beaches, the abstract world of intelligence deception transformed into concrete military advantage. Garcia would later receive recognition from both Britain and Germany, the only person in the war to be decorated by both sides. But on this day, he simply continued transmitting, maintaining his fictional network even as the invasion he had helped enable unfolded across the Channel. The Norman fields, green with early summer growth, now bore witness to the beginning of Nazi Germany's final chapter. What had started with captured spies in London safe houses had culminated in Allied boots on European soil and the slow, inexorable march toward Berlin. Legacy of deception, a quiet victory. In the months that followed, as Allied forces pressed deeper into Europe, the architects of deception began to reckon with what they had accomplished. The double-cross system had proven that truth itself could become a weapon, that fiction, carefully crafted, could reshape the course of history. Theresa Miller found herself in a quiet London pub one autumn evening, watching ordinary people share ordinary conversations, unaware that the very normalcy they enjoyed had been purchased through years of elaborate lies. The weight of secrecy would remain with her always. The knowledge that victory had required not just courage, but the systematic manipulation of human trust. Garcia returned to his quiet life, his fictional army dissolved like morning mist, while Popov carried forward the restless energy of a man who had lived too many lives. The German agents they had deceived, those who survived the war's end, would spend years wondering how completely they had been betrayed by their own reports. The files would remain classified for decades, the full scope of the deception hidden even from those who had lived through its consequences. But in the gentle evening light filtering through pub windows, in the soft murmur of voices speaking freely without fear, the true legacy of Operation Fortitude lived on. A testament to the quiet victories won not through force of arms, but through the patient, meticulous craft of those who understood that sometimes the greatest triumphs are achieved when the enemy never realizes they have been defeated at all.